So the question is OCT useful for discriminating between pseudopapilledema and papilledema? And first we'll hear from Dr. Elderi as to why OCT may be a useful modality.
So the audience seems to think that it is useful, so I'm going to make my point with no drama. So papilledema is a type of optic disc edema that is caused by high intracranial pressure, and usually central vision is spared in early papilledema. And optic nerve heads with low-grade papilledema can be difficult to distinguish on exam from pseudopapilledema due to optic nerve head drusen in particular. We have multiple modalities to try to distinguish the two entities. We have fundoscopic examination, looking for spontaneous venous pulsations if a child is good enough to sit for them, fundus autofluorescence, ultrasound, OCT, and fluorescein angiogram. So I'm going to be talking about OCT because that's what I've been assigned to do. And OCT is very versatile. There's multiple protocols we can do. A lot of times, most people will think, oh, OCT of the optic nerve, we just obtain the retinal nerve fiber layer, and that's where we stop. But actually, when I get an OCT, I look at multiple protocols. So the first one is a retinal nerve fiber layer scan. It's quite easy to understand why we use it. This premise is a swollen nerve are more likely to be associated with a thicker retinal nerve fiber layer, and it actually correlates with the Frisson scale. That's a paper that was published in 2010. It's very useful for monitoring over time. It does have some pitfalls, namely segmentation errors. So if you get the printout and you don't have the luxury of going into the machine and fixing it, you're going to get a wrong answer. High hyperopes might measure a thicker retinal nerve fiber layer just because of the optics of the machine. And in the setting of optic atrophy superimposed on edema, the retinal nerve fiber layer may look normal, giving us a deceiving answer. The other protocol we look at is the cross-section scan of the optic nerve, and this paper came out in 2013 in Ophthalmology. So basically, they did enhanced depth imaging of the optic nerve, and what they found out is those little hyperreflective material underneath the optic nerve that correlated with the presence of optic nerve head drusen, and lots of people were happy about this information. The other thing we look at when we're looking at the Bruch membrane opening is that if you have very high intracranial pressure, you actually get deformation of the posterior pole that we see on an MRI as flattening of the posterior pole. You can actually see it on the OCT as upward bowing of Bruch's membrane. The problem with this one is that it's not very sensitive for mild increase in the intracranial pressure, so some people may not have that sign. If we look at the other thing we need to be aware of is when we looked at our patients who had IIH, as the high intracranial pressure resolved, as they got better throughout their disease, we found out that a lot of them had the same hyperreflective material on the OCT. So we brought them back and we did an ultrasound, and a lot of them actually had a bright spot on the ultrasound consistent with a potential drusen, despite the fact that the papilledema, the nerve itself, got better over time. So this came out recently in 2018. It's a consensus study looking at those hyperreflective material under the optic nerve, because it came out that, well, you can see them in papilledema itself. What was funny is that this paper was actually, these pictures were actually published in the early 1920s or something by a German group, and they found out that you can actually see these hyperreflective ovoid-like material, that's what they're calling them now, in papilledema. So they're not very useful to distinguish papilledema from pseudopapilledema. There are other features in particular you can look at to distinguish the drusen and the reflectivity, but I'll leave that to the person who's saying no, OCT is not useful. And the last part is if you measure the Bruch membrane opening, the average is about 1,500. When the Bruch membrane, when there is papilledema, we found out that the Bruch membrane opening is actually enlarged, and when there's pseudopapilledema, the Bruch membrane opening is actually small. And as we treat the papilledema, it decreases and goes back to normal. So that's actually a very useful sign for me as well. The other thing I look at is the macular scans. If I see cystic changes in the macula, that's indicative of previous optic atrophy, a thin ganglion cell layer, and if I see some photoreceptor changes, they're indicative of a previous severe papilledema. So in conclusion, this is a personal opinion, not a recommendation. I think that OCT is useful for the diagnosis of pseudopapilledema versus papilledema. Like any other testing modality in medicine, it's neither 100% sensitive nor is it 100% specific. And the final decision on further workup should be made in conjunction with the history, examination, and visual fields. My favorite part about OCT is follow-up over time. So this is a child with papilledema who was sent to me, and I thought he had pseudopapilledema. And when I stopped his Diamox, he actually swelled back up, so I put him back on the Diamox. So there are little tricks that you have to combine, one, evolution over time, and the rest of the history and the examination to make that decision. But it is useful. It's not mandatory, and it's not 100% sensitive. Thank you.